Geopolitics and Empire is joined by the Raw Egg Nationalist, author of the Eggs Benedict Option. He was recently featured in Tucker Carlson's documentary, The End of Men, and he also produces Man's World magazine at mansworldmag.org, which is free. His work is amazing, and welcome to Geopolitics and Empire, Ren.
It's a pleasure to be here.
As I was telling you before the interview, that I'm a latecomer to Raw Egg Nationalism, and I'm slowly getting into it. And maybe just to start, if you could tell us briefly whatever you like about, who is the Raw Egg Nationalist, a bit about Vince Gironda and the movement, Raw Egg Nationalism. How long would you say the movement has been around?
Yeah, it would be my pleasure to explain. So the movement's been around really just since around about the beginning of 2020. That's certainly when I kind of got behind the hashtag Raw Egg Nationalism. So I'd been lurking around on Twitter. I was a follower of Bronze Age perverts, but I hadn't really posted anything up until that time. And I just got behind this hashtag in a major way. People were talking about Vince Gironda. People were talking about slonking, which is the technical term, slonking raw eggs. And I took the ball and ran with it. And here we are, nearly 3 years later. Well, 3 years later, yeah, 3 years later, and it's become a bit of a phenomenon, really. But the central insight, really, behind Raw Egg Nationalism is that a nation is only as strong as the people of which it is composed, and you only need to look around today to see that people are very, very ill indeed, and that has all sorts of implications for politics and for the health of politics. But why eggs in particular? Well, eggs are a superfood. Eggs are a much maligned superfood. There's been a lot of propaganda, most of it, vast majority of it, false over the last sort of 50 to 70 years about eggs, about how eating eggs is bad for you, which is nonsense. They are, as I say, a superfood. They're one of nature's great superfoods. They have a kind of symbolic value because what they represent is they represent everything. They represent the opposite, basically, of everything that we're told we should be eating today. They are the opposite of the kind of plant-based, corporate-controlled foods that we are told are the future of food. They're easy to produce. They're cheap. They're incredibly nutritious, and there's really no way that you can. Control the production of eggs in the way that these big global food producing corporations, which are gobbling up more and more of the food supply, want. So, you can't patent an egg. This is what I like to say, but you can patent a plant-based egg. And that's one of the reasons why corporations now are moving into breaking into the new ownership envelope of plant-based foods and genetically modified foods, is precisely because they can control them. And that's a theme that runs all through my work is corporate control and how to break it. But to go back, you talked about Vince Gironda, and yes, Vince Gironda he's like the founding, well, not the founding father, but he's the sort of he's the kind of symbolic father, I suppose, of Raw Egg Nationalism. He was a maverick bodybuilder in the 1960s, and he trained all sorts of incredibly famous bodybuilders, Arnold Schwarzenegger, for instance, the first ever Mr. Olympia, Larry Scott. He also trained a who's who of celebrities, Carl Weathers, who played Apollo Creed in the Rocky films, Cher, Clint Eastwood, all sorts of people like that. He had a gym in West Hollywood called Vince's Gym. But one of the things that he was totally against was the use of anabolic steroids. He was a very, very vocal advocate of natural bodybuilding. He came up in the 1940s and late 1940s, 1950s, early 1960s was when he really made his name. And that's when steroids didn't have, although people were using steroids by that point, they didn't have the prominent place they would later occupy in bodybuilding. And eggs were his alternative to anabolic steroids because of their huge cholesterol content, and that's one of the reasons why eggs have been so egg consumption has been so disparaged by the medical establishment is because of the cholesterol content. But actually, that is only a good thing. It's not just the protein; it's the cholesterol that you want, because cholesterol has an anabolic effect. And recent scientific studies have actually substantiated some of Vince Gironda's theories about egg consumption and muscle gain. So there's a scientist called Steve Reichman, for instance, who did studies about cholesterol consumption and whole egg consumption, and he showed that there's actually a closer correlation between consumption of cholesterol and muscle gain than there is between consumption of protein and muscle gain. So we tend to think, oh, you need to eat as much protein as possible in order to build muscle. And yes, that's true. But actually, what it looks like is cholesterol consumption is even more important. So that means that you shouldn't be, like a lot of bodybuilders, you shouldn't be throwing away the egg whites. You should be throwing away the egg yolks rather than just consuming the whites. You need to be consuming the egg whole, and you need to be eating fatty, nutrient-dense animal foods.
A quick shout out to our sponsors, which you can locate via the sponsor page on geopoliticsandempire.com, or whose links are included in every podcast description. I've tried privacy phones in the past, such as Silent Circle's Black Phone, which turned out to be a dud. The best and really only option so far is de-Googling your phone. Now, you can do it yourself, but I've never had the time to figure that out and simply got an Above phone. They sell de-Googled phones that come with a suite of software. They also provide support and a monthly Above privacy suite with many features such as a unique phone number, encryption, email, VPN, and so forth. If you're looking for a private phone, check out Above Phone. Make sure to click on the Above Phone link on geopoliticsandempire.com or via the podcast description so that we can enjoy a commission. Also, check out the Nomos Time Bank at nomos.net, which you can download in Spanish or English to your Apple or Google or de-Googled phone. Nomos allows people in your community to exchange services using time as a currency rather than fiat money. This will be one great way to survive in the coming algorithm ghetto. If you need health insurance, you can talk to my friend James Guzman of the Borderless blog, podcast, and health insurance. He offers free consultations. Simply schedule a time with him over at borderlesshealthinsurance.com. Finally, you can donate directly to Geopolitics and Empire, consult with me, the host, or become a member to join private monthly member Zoom calls where we shoot the breeze discussing world events. Yeah, and your book, I think, is very important. Again, I highly recommend the Eggs Benedict option. I get it straight from the publisher in the electronic version because I'm down here in Mexico. It takes a while to get physical books, and I've kind of gotten tired about reading about the Great Reset. But your focus on food and politics, it was a really fresh approach, but more importantly, very motivating. It is a real kick in the butt. For me, and after we finish this interview, I'm going to go work out and eat some eggs. But to get your thoughts on the whole Great Reset and globalism and what we're up against, you start, if you want to tell us briefly, you start with the sort of deep history and the deep context, which I think is important. Plato, who basically Plato's view was pretty oligarchic, totalitarian, his view of politics, and that there was an original Great Reset. What we're going through in some ways is not new. It's almost like a cycle. And one of the aspects of the original Great Reset was to remove meat and protein from the plebes, to keep us weak and domesticated. So if you want to just briefly touch on the original Great Reset.
Yeah, of course. So the book, the preface of the book is about a very short section of Book 2 of Plato's Republic, where Plato's Socrates is talking to two of his companions, Glaucon and Adeimantus, about the origins of society, basically. And they start talking in hypothetical terms about how a society might come together. And you end up with Plato's Socrates positing this idea that actually a perfect harmonious society would have to be vegetarian, because basically if people start eating meat, then I think this is what these are the words he actually says. their tempers will become inflamed, and they'll start to desire more than they have. They'll start to essentially to revolt against their humble lot. So the book starts with this idea that actually there's a very, very ancient understanding of the relationship between diet and social control. So even as far back as 330 BC, 340 BC, whenever Plato wrote the Republic, social planners, and I consider philosophers are social planners. Plato, is talking about how you would plan a society. So as far as I'm concerned, that makes him a social planner. Social planners knew that you could alter the very nature of a society and how it worked by making changes to the diet of the ordinary people. So, I mean, that's a pretty striking idea, and it's one that we see echo down through the ages to today, to the Great Reset. But when I talk about the original Great Reset, what I'm actually doing is I'm actually going even further back in time to the agricultural revolution. So that's basically the transition to settled agriculture, so fixed field agriculture, domesticated animals as well, in the Near East, beginning about 10,000 years ago, let's say. So the book is based on a comparison between what happened then in the Neolithic, in the agricultural revolution, and what the globalists want for the world today. So the Neolithic revolution was a total social transformation, and initially what you have, or before the Neolithic revolution, what you have is small bands of mobile hunter-gatherers moving around the landscape, following migratory patterns of animals, of birds, of mammals, fishing, foraging. But fundamentally what you've got then is small groups of people moving around. You don't have cities or towns or any kind of urban settlements. You might have proto settlements, but they're probably not inhabited all year round. You might inhabit a settlement site, say, for a few months because it's in a good position to catch the migration route of gazelles or something like that, or antelope or whatever. But then what you have with the agricultural revolution is you have the emergence of the first urban settlements and the first states. So really what we're talking about is a social transformation that is built on a transformation of the way that food is produced and distributed. So you don't get these early states without grain agriculture, because grain agriculture is the only way that you can, in the Neolithic, is the only way really that you can produce a surplus for taxation. And that's what states are built on, is surplus extraction by an elite. So, I mean, hopefully you can see some of the parallels already emerging between what happened then and what is planned to happen today with the Great Reset. So you've got a food transformation, and today that is a transformation from animal-based agriculture to a totally plant-based, or almost totally plant-based diet for the world's population, for the 10 billion people who are supposed to make up the world's population in 2050. And off the back of that, then you have a total change in every other aspect of our lives, from the way that we live and work, to the way that we're governed. So, I mean, what the World Economic Forum and these globalists want is they want basically for corporations to take up most of the functions of governance. So these corporations that are going to be producing food and distributing it, and they're going to be producing food because the kinds of foods that are envisaged to feed this population of 10 billion are foods that will be totally within corporate control. So we're talking about new varieties of GMO grains and legumes. And the thing you have to understand there is that any kind of GMO product can be owned by patents. And that's why corporations like them. And then you've got all sorts of these things like novel proteins, lab-grown meat. Again, you can patent that because it's a special process that can be owned. So you've got a totally corporate-owned food supply, and then just corporate governance, basically, of every other aspect of life as well. But it's built fundamentally, this new edifice, this whole new sort of social pyramid, whatever you want to call it, is built on a transformation of food, just like the agricultural revolution 10,000 years ago. So I draw out in as much detail as possible the very clear parallels between these two processes, and I try to suggest that actually we're seeing the unfolding of a very, very ancient logic, which was expressed, as I say in the preface, by Plato, that you can plan and alter a society by changing the way that food is produced and consumed.
And I like that you use as a basis, you cite in your book, James Scott's Against the Grain, I believe, A Deep History of the Earliest States.
Yes.
I've had that book on my wish list for many years now, and I guess I'm going to have to finally buy it and read it. But
it's really good. It's really good.
Mm-hmm. And it's this current Great Reset, this new Great Reset. It seems like technology is the game changer. The whole digital infrastructure that's been, really borne out since the Second World War, DARPA creating the internet and GPS and, everything that we have today. In your book, you call it global corporate government. This is something I've been looking at for the past 2 decades, especially as a conservative Christian, this idea of world government. And with the technology they have today, they can achieve 100% planetary control of, every geography on the planet. And then that would entail, as you're talking about, food and economy and people, like nothing we've seen in history. And, just a couple of days ago, you had Brazil's president, Lula, in the White House sitting with Biden, openly calling for world government, for world governance. And he used the phrase world governance and global governance, and to force all nation states to obey this world governance. I mean, they're so in our faces now. I also posted a clip that went viral on Twitter, almost 2 million views now, of Lula saying that the social welfare Bolsa Familia offered to poor Brazilians now will be cut off unless they get vaxxed. And he even said, if you got to take 10 or 50 COVID vax, I don't care. But if you don't, you're going to be cut off. And so any further thoughts you have regarding their plans? I mean, they're openly in January, they met, they were talking about no cars for us in the future, taking away our property. You cite Michael Rechnewald in your book, who's been a guest on my program. And
fantastic.
Yeah. And, how serious do you take their project, and any further thoughts on what they want to do?
Oh, I think it's real. I think it's definitely real. I don't. I mean, one of the things that I try to stress in the book is that, look, I'm not a conspiracy theorist. Although, of course, I hate that term because of the way that it's used polemically and is used to, has been used to discredit people since the assassination of John F. Kennedy. But that's another point. I'm not. All throughout the book, I am referring directly to easily accessible sources. All of the claims that I'm making about what the World Economic Forum, wants to do with the global food supply, or what corporations are doing in order to, sort of capture the food supply. This is all easily accessible material that you can find, and so if you don't believe it, you can verify it. And I think that there's a dangerous tendency when we talk about the World Economic Forum, for instance, to turn the organization, and especially Klaus Schwab, into some kind of sort of all-powerful kind of secret cabal. I'm not sure how much that is true, and I'm not sure what power, if any, someone like Klaus Schwab really has. Nonetheless, I do think that to the kind of things that the World Economic Forum has been talking about for a long time, all of these sort of dystopian dystopian pieces that they've been putting out for a long time, including, most famously, Welcome to 2030, I Own Nothing, Have No Privacy, and Life Has Never Been Better. That's a very famous think piece from 2017. I think that it's real, and the fact that basically every world leader you care to name is parroting their stuff, and they're all going to Davos and all that sort of stuff, should give us reason to believe that this is real. But I mean, one of the things that I have been talking about recently that I think is very interesting, and that people perhaps don't appreciate enough, but really should start to appreciate, is how important migration, and in particularly what's being called climate migration, is going to be to the social transformation of the Great Reset. So there's this, I've been writing for American Mind, the Claremont Institute, for a while now, and I did a review recently of this absolutely insane book called Nomad Century by Gaia Vince, who is basically a World Economic Forum approved science writer, science popularizer. And basically the argument of the book is that because we know climate change is going to be totally catastrophic, and there's nothing that we can actually really do to prevent it from being a catastrophe, that means that large parts of the world, mainly the third world, are going to become uninhabitable within a period of decades. We're talking 20 years, and large parts of the central belt of the Earth, the most densely inhabited part of the world, are going to be uninhabitable. So we know that that's going to happen. So what we have to do in the West, this is our obligation, not only because we are the most developed of the world's nations, but also because we are the worst, or have been historically the worst polluters. We have to encourage all of the people living in the areas of the world that are going to be affected by climate change to move to the West now. So that's billions of people. And the book is just arguing that case. And it's a pretty flimsy argument that's easy to take apart. And it sounds mad. How can we accommodate 10 billion people, which is what the world's population is going to be in 2050, according to projections, in the global north, in the small number of countries, in North America, Canada, Northern Europe, UK, Scandinavia, Russia. How can we accommodate all of these people? How can we accommodate 10 billion people? But that is the argument that she's making. Anyway, this idea that is what needs to happen, and that is what is going to happen, is really starting to gain ground now. So at the World Economic Forum's last meeting at Davos a month or however long ago it was, Al Gore said in one of his slightly sort of more bizarre, unhinged kind of rants, he said, what are we going to do when 1.5 billion people wash up on our shores? It's going to totally destroy our ability to govern ourselves. And he didn't actually sound too unhappy about that prospect. So, increasingly what I think is that climate migration, massively increased migration, is going to be used as a wedge to drive the Great Reset. Basically, that's what I think. And I think that people should be paying attention to this narrative, this developing narrative about climate migration and how it needs to happen now in order to prevent loss of life and suffering further down the line.
Yeah, as you say, some of their ideas are nuts. I remember a decade ago, they had the UN COP meeting, I think in Cancun, somewhere here in Mexico, and I was reading some of their white papers, and they were discussing forced relocation. I'm like, are you nuts? So, like, you want to put out this idea that you can force me off of my property to, the western part of Mexico just because y'all say, and it's almost like they want to herd us into these urban globalist smart cities. I saw the other week article out of China where they're building these massive, ugly cement apartment complexes, and that's where they're sticking all of the pigs, like these pig farms and these like
I saw that,
and it's kind of like what they want to do with us, and just sticking with the American mind. I've had on the podcast as well James Poulos of American Mind, who does great work, and you just published a piece yesterday that you co-authored, and I thought this was interesting. We've heard of Jordan Peterson's recent idea that he's gonna in London, I think, in this fall, he's gonna bring together 2,000 plus people to form an alternative Davos, a sort of anti-Davos, and you posit that it's not an antidote to globalist chaos. Maybe if you want to just tell us briefly your thoughts on Jordan Peterson's idea.
So this is a piece that I co-authored with my good friend John McGleon, who writes regularly for American Mind and for other multitude of other publications. Actually, he's very prolific. We banged our heads together and came up with this piece. And basically, I mean, I think that Jordan Peterson is just doing what Jordan Peterson does best, which is talking to an audience of people. You know, I mean, that is very much his modus operandi now, right? Is to gather an audience and to spread his message, or to spread a message, a positive message, or what he considers to be a positive message. And I mean, I think that we've reached such a critical stage now that talking isn't enough. And what I say in the article is that actually the only thing that seems to have worked thus far is America First nationalism under Donald Trump. That's really the 4 years of the Trump presidency are really the only major setback on the road to global governance we've seen thus far. I mean, okay, other countries have resisted to some extent, countries like Iran, Hungary, China, Russia, but really nothing. None of them have done anything that's proved anywhere near as effective or as sort of worrying for the globalists as what Trump did during the 4 years of his presidency, even though he was so effectively neutered in so many different ways. Even the small things that he managed to do had his globalist opponents in absolute uproar, and they did absolutely everything they could to try and sabotage his presidency. So my argument really in the piece is that, look, we know the arguments against globalism, and in America there is already a pre-established demographic of at least 73.6 million people who voted for Trump, who believe in America First to some degree, some obviously much more than others. What we need is a return to America First. We don't need more talking. We don't need the glorified Joe Rogan podcast on the evils of globalism. We need an effective leader to start doing the things Trump was doing in his first term and do them better, do them more effectively. That's how we fight the Great Reset.
Yeah, the hour is late, I would agree. And mentioning Hungary, by the way, I saw this week, Samantha Powers of USAID is out there in Hungary, and I was preparing the ground for the next color revolution. Absolutely crazy. And you talk about Dugin in your book, Alexander Dugin, and maybe just to get your thoughts on the philosophical and ideological nature of the threat and this global liberal system, people call it as well, GAY, the globalist American empire. I was reading your Man's World magazine yesterday, where there was a hilarious section talking about basically this. I mean, the globalist American empire is going around the world, overthrowing countries that have traditional conservative values, and then trying to shove down their throats this rainbow fascism, as my past guest Jim Jatras calls it, like making the world safe for transgenderism and wokeism and all this crazy stuff. And any further thoughts you have on this? And I kind of do, as an American myself. I appreciate the Constitution and a lot of Americana, but when I study world government, it seems that the liberal nation state is actually one way towards globalism or world government, because they talk about a world federation as basically the conception of world government, where it would only be possible via nation states to be connected together into this sort of fake democratic global system. So in some ways, the nation state lends itself towards world government. But as you mentioned before, if we have strongmen managing properly the nation state, we can prevent that. But yeah, and any thoughts on Dugin and the global liberal system?
Well, yeah. So I use Dugin in the book, really. So he wrote a short, a pretty short little book, or little book was published of his thoughts about the Great Reset, called "The Great Reset versus the Great Awakening." I think it's a series of might be an article that he wrote and some interviews. I think it's published by Arctos. But I mean, I'm not familiar with. I've read some other of his work, but I'm not like a Dugin scholar or anything. So what I really take away from Dugin and from this Great Reset book is his intellectual genealogy, if you will, of the Great Reset, and he traces the ideas of the Great Reset, the idea that basically it's a kind of final dissolution of all forms of previously meaningful identity, like the nation, and even perhaps what it is to be human, because of course transhumanism is a big thing that's been pushed and is being pushed by the World Economic Forum and by globalists, and has been pushed for some time. But he traces the Great Reset's genealogy through liberalism back to the Middle Ages, back to this debate that took place between medieval theologians in the universities of Europe, and the debate is basically over the existence of universals. And it's quite a convoluted sort of it's a very, very technical debate that took place, but it basically revolves around the question of whether or not there are actual real categories within the world, or whether basically meaning and identity are arbitrary. And although in the short term, then the idea that there are actually real meaningful entities in the world, then in the long term, the view that there aren't, which is known as nominalism. And it's known as nominalism because basically nomina, that's the Latin plural for names. Nomen is the singular. And basically what it means is the names that we give to things are arbitrary. That's it. It's like they're arbitrary convention. They don't have any existence independent of our sort of conceptualization of them and custom. So the emergence and the eventual longer term victory of this idea of nominalism is what actually kind of gives birth to the modern liberal world order. It is responsible for the Reformation in some sense, which is the great schism that occurred in Christianity in the 16th century, more or less initiated by Martin Luther. And from then on, it develops into, after the fracturing of Christendom, it develops into liberalism, into this idea that the greatest good for society is basically the liberation of the individual from the constraints of tradition. That's progress. That's the direction we're moving in. We're moving away from all of these arbitrary medieval conventions of the past, forms of identity, religious belonging, all that kind of thing. And so that's liberalism. And then what do you get after liberalism? Well, you get the Great Reset eventually, where, having liberated humanity from all sorts of, more or less all of the kind of arbitrary conventions of the past, you end up in a position where what you're doing is liberating humankind from humanity itself, and that's transhumanism, and that's the sort of agenda of today, is liberating people from gender, liberating people from what it means to be a human being. So Dugin sees a very, very clear intellectual genealogy running back from the Great Reset to the Middle Ages, and I think that's a very, very, I think that's a striking idea, and I think it. I mean, it's a grand idea, but I think that what it does, among other things, is allows us to see that actually, I don't think that we can fight the Great Reset by going back to liberalism. Liberalism created the problem in certain respects, because it was, liberalism itself didn't create the problem. The problem came through liberalism, but liberalism is one of the forms that it takes. And so actually returning to that doesn't, we're just a few steps back on the road to globalism, rather than being off it for good. So, I mean, that's really what I take away from Dugin, and I think that is interesting, and I think it's a fruitful way to engage with the Great Reset, rather than just seeing the Great Reset as something that's been cooked up by some ultra rich people in Davos or at the Club of Rome. It's something much deeper. It's a civilizational trajectory that we have been on for a long time, and that means that we've got to do something major to change. It's not just a minor correction that we need. We actually need something far more substantial.
Yeah, and the road that liberalism is taking us down, I mean, I view it as like suicide, self-destruction. And just this week, I mean, looking at some of the consequences, I mean, I almost fell off my chair this week in Spain. I'm reading they've just legalized bestiality. You have this Yale Japanese scholar telling
that was mad.
The elderly in Japan to go kill themselves. I'm like, what? And in Argentina, I'm reading 30% decline in births, which is a global trend, and they chalk it up to the primary causes of the illegal abortion and feminism. I mean, it's like we're just going to blow up. It's civilizational suicide. And you touch on Putin, Russia, you talk about Russia as being a bulwark against this. And yes, I'd agree, but I'm still very confused. And I asked my guests this, and I'm on the fence. I don't know. But when we talk about Putin and Xi Jinping and China, and it does seem that many countries, including Hungary and others you've mentioned, are trying to preserve their social systems, heritage, and whatnot. But then I can't quite square. They have also implemented part of this Great Reset technocracy, especially the COVID stuff, biometrics, QR codes, health passports. And so I'm trying to square. Sometimes, it seems like Putin is defending the world. Other times it's like, what are you doing, Vlad? And then, have you thought about that? How do you square that?
Yeah, I don't know that I can square it either. I think that there are, I mean, Dugin is Russian, right? Dugin is a Russian ultra-nationalist, if you want to call him that. He's been called other things as well. I mean, he is very much on the side of on Putin's side. So, I mean, I think that the picture that he presents of what he calls the Great Awakening. So, the Great Awakening is this sort of grassroots, organic response to globalism, to the plan for world government that has arisen around the world in various different places. So you've got, the Trump, the MAGA awakening in the US. You've got Russia under Putin, China under Xi Jinping, Orban in Hungary, Salvini in Italy, and broader populism in Europe, Farage in Britain, all that kind of stuff. I mean, he presents all of that as being. Well, he basically says that actually all of these different movements, although they're disparate, it can kind of unite together to present a global united front against globalism. And I think that, as I say in the book, I think that's optimistic in the extreme. And yes, it is. I don't think that the US can probably, especially now after the Ukraine war, even under Trump, can really put its differences with Russia to one side. I don't know that the US can put its differences with Iran other Islamic regimes to the side either, or even with China, to be honest with you. I think that what we might end up with is a kind of détente between all of those countries and some sort of cooperation, but it will always be suspicious cooperation. That's what I would say. But yeah, to go back to your initial point about sort of the technocracy and the COVID response, then yes, I mean it has been baffling. It has been baffling, and it's unclear how to interpret it. I don't really know whether it's. I mean, you have all of these elaborate theories about, sort of people playing 4D and 5D and 6D chess. I don't really place much store by that. Part of me just thinks that in large part the COVID response. I mean, obviously, I think that authoritarians have capitalized on it for sure. There's no doubt about that. But the extent to which it has been coordinated globally from the start, I don't know. I mean, none of us is privy to everything that went on behind the scenes, so we can only sort of guess or come to some kind of sort of judgment based on what evidence we do have access to. So I don't know whether, for instance, someone like Russia, Putin implemented those measures just because at the time he thought that it was for the best, that it was the best way to respond to the global emergency, or whether something else was going on. So I just don't know. But yes, it certainly should make us. We certainly do need to think hard about it. It does raise some quite worrying questions.
Yeah, difficult question. And let's turn toward food and some of the solutions you advocate. I think you said you don't eat grains, and you talk about Weston Price. I'm a huge fan of Weston Price Foundation.
Fantastic.
And I think I was reading about this over a decade ago, and how he studied that the healthiest people groups ate mostly food, meats and seafood and butter and dairy. I spent a year in the Gobi and living in a yurt in Mongolia, where it was basically just meat and dairy, camel meat, horse meat, you name it. And it was fantastic. Although I did notice on the list that in your book, they also did eat the bugs. They ate insects. And so just your further thoughts on this, as well as sort of the Eggs Benedict option, which is, I think, focusing on ourselves now to be as strong as we physically can, intellectually, spiritually, and because that's basically the first and biggest step as individuals and citizens and communities. Before we go to the next step, as you said, the nation is only as strong as its citizens. So, further thoughts on food and diet and focusing on yourself, as well as the fact that they've also, the strongmen in the past did also eat insects. I thought that was interesting.
Yeah, the interesting thing about insects, what you could say about insects is that although traditional societies have eaten insects, or certain traditional societies have eaten insects, then it wasn't their principal protein source. So it would have. I mean, there is a lot of protein in insects and things like that, but it would never have. You would never have found, for instance, the Plains Indians, for instance, would never have derived anything other than a small portion of their daily caloric needs from things like insects. It was bison that they wanted to kill and eat, right? So, yeah, I mean, insects are a part of traditional diets around the world. In some places more than others, but they were never the principal protein source. It was always, certainly in traditional societies, where things are going well, then they were definitely not the main protein source. And there's actually a very interesting article that I cite in the book and that I've talked about on Twitter and in some of my other books as well. The Diet of the Mountain Men by, I think it's William Holston, in the Huntington Library Quarterly or something. It's a historical article from the 1960s anyway, and it's about the diets of the mountain men. So Leonardo DiCaprio's character in The Revenant is a mountain man. These were the hunters and trappers who ventured into the deep wilderness beyond the early American frontier to hunt and trap, and they basically went native. And anyway, this article is about their diets and the fact that they basically ate, just meat, just game and bison and whatever they could get their hands on. But it has some interesting anecdotes about what some of the mountain men were reduced to in periods of extreme deprivation. So they were always, because of the weather and because of the harshness of the environment, and there was always a risk of ending up in extremis in a very, very difficult situation. And sometimes that might mean plunging your face into an anthill and eating as many ants as possible in order to get some nutrition, or indeed eating the leather from your own shoes. So but yeah, let's talk about diet more generally. The Weston Price stuff is fantastic, is really great. It's the foundation, or it has come to be the foundation of my view of diet in general, which is that, yes, we need to prioritize these nutrient dense animal foods that our ancestors consumed and thrived on. And of course, that is precisely the opposite of the global plant-based diet that is being the planetary health diet. That's what the World Economic Forum calls it. That is being proposed for us today. So, really, I mean, my work is about returning to the ways of the ancestors and what we need, how we can do that, how in order to guarantee individual health, what we need to do is we need to take on and defeat the corporate agricultural system that is moving in lockstep with the globalists towards this plant-based future. So it's very much about how guaranteeing individual health is necessarily not just about buying the right food for yourself, but actually creating a broader political movement that can guarantee that we have access to those foods in the first place. So that is the basis of the Eggs Benedict option, is a kind of new sort of populist movement that stakes claim to the foods that our ancestors thrived on, because obviously the globalists want to deprive us of those foods. It's the foundation of their social revolution is getting us to give up those foods. So yeah, it's the Weston Price stuff is fundamental, and I would say to anybody actually that if you ever read one book on nutrition, it should be Nutrition and Physical Degeneration, which is his 1939 masterpiece. He was a dentist. I'll just talk about him for a moment. He was a dentist from Cleveland, Ohio, at the turn of the 20th century. And he noticed that over time that more and more of his patients, especially children, were coming into his surgery displaying all sorts of really quite unpleasant dental malformations of the jaw, crowded teeth, dreadful cavities, and what he observed that actually these dental malformations were symptoms of a kind of broader sort of crisis or problems with their physiognomy. So if you have bad teeth and a poorly formed jaw, then the rest of your face suffers as a result. Your cheeks, your chin will be recessed. You'll have narrow airways. You'll have problems breathing, and you'll be very, very unhealthy. So he noticed that people's dentition, which is an index of wider health, was getting worse and worse. And he hypothesized quite sensibly that this was probably something to do with what people were eating. And the broader context of the time is that people in America were starting to move away from whole food, based diets to diets that were based on industrial foodstuffs, new foodstuffs that were being produced using refined flour, refined grain products, added sugars, novel vegetable oils and seed oils. These are foods that people had never eaten before in any quantity. So people were moving away from the traditional sort of diets that people had eaten, the traditional whole food, locally produced diets. So what Weston Price decided to do was to go on a globe-trotting trek and look for traditional societies eating their traditional diets and see how things were with them. And what he discovered was that, contrary to what you might believe and what you might be sort of told by the kind of popular narrative, actually in traditional societies, like, for instance, among the Masai Mara in Africa, or the Inuit in the high Arctic Canada and Alaska, or among the Torres Strait Islanders off the coast of Australia, the small islands, then traditional peoples eating traditional foods displayed what he called perfect health, as displayed in their dentition and facial development. So, they had properly formed broad jaws, broadly formed cheeks, beautiful teeth that weren't crowded at all, no cavities, properly formed noses and airways. They were beautiful people. And actually, one of the great strengths of the book is that, or one of the great selling points of the book is that he has pictures of people's faces and of the insides of their mouths to illustrate the points that he's making about how diet is essential for health and for facial development. And he basically, I think what he ends up coming up with is almost like a series of basically what you would call iron laws of nutrition. These are as close as you could get to sort of scientific laws about what human beings should be eating. It's an amazing book. It's an amazing book, and it's incredibly informative. And yeah, I would recommend it to anybody to read. Certainly, if you read one nutrition book, then that's what it should be.
Yeah, and you mentioned a few other things in your book, like the Turner thesis, this idea of
Yes.
the American frontier. And it's funny because I'm from Chicago, Illinois originally, but growing up, I somehow intuitively, that's always been a part of my worldview, this sort of Americana. I don't know if, this grit, this frontier-like lifestyle and worldview. And I don't know if I got it through osmosis or just reading. And, that's one of the good parts of the U.S. So, that's interesting. And you also talk about towards the end, I think, there's nowhere to run from this world government. If you were in the Soviet Union, Nazi Germany, you name whatever totalitarian system going back centuries, you could always escape to another country. But what they're planning, there's going to be no escape. I mean, here in Mexico, they were running QR codes. In some states, you couldn't buy food if you weren't injected with Pentagon
crazy
juice. I mean, so everywhere from all over the planet. And you also talk about the dacha system. I was living in Kazakhstan a few years ago and hanging out at Kazakh and Russian and even Cuban dachas. There were a few Cubans left over from the Cold War living in Kazakhstan. And we were sipping on vodka, eating plov and bishparmak and Russian barbecue. And it was fascinating to see what they've done. And what you detailed in your book, I mean, they have a short growing season. And I saw them ferment and can a lot of their fruits and vegetables and put it in their cellar. And the entire long winter, they'd be whipping out these the crops that they had worked on in the short growing season. But and any further thoughts on resisting defeating the Great Reset?
Now, it's good that you bring up this idea that actually there isn't anywhere to run, because that's something that James. Well, I was thinking basically, or I used James Scott's Against the Grain particularly, throughout the book. But one of the things that he talks about is the fact that actually, for the longest time, probably up until the state became the dominant political form, in the world, which wasn't really maybe until the 17th century. It wasn't that long ago that more people in the world lived outside anything that we would recognize as a state than within one. But for the longest time, from the agricultural revolution, from the beginnings of the agricultural revolution to, maybe 300 years ago, you always had the opportunity to run away if you didn't want to be a peasant. And lots did. The ranks of the Mongols and of the steppe nomads and the Huns and the Plains Indians and all sorts of other barbarian, or what were called barbarian groups, were swelled by a constant inflow of cultivators who didn't want to be cultivators anymore because being a cultivator wasn't particularly much fun. And that's one of the reasons why in the ancient world, you have to understand that walls, including the Great Wall of China and other boundary walls, fortified walls, were built as much to keep people inside states as to keep them out. So, the Great Wall of China wasn't just built to keep out the Mongols. It was also built to keep in the settled peasant cultivators who might otherwise want to run away and become something more akin to a nomad. But of course, all of that is gone now. So there's no way that we can do that. So what I say in the book is that we have to stand and fight. These are our nations, and if we want to resist the Great Reset, then we have to resist here and now, not from somewhere else at some other point in the future, because there won't be somewhere else and there won't be another time when we can do it. I mean, the dasher gardening thing is fascinating and is something that we could spend, a whole podcast talking about on its own. It's basically this system in Russia and the former Soviet Union, but particularly in Russia, of people growing their own food, basically having small plots of land, either where they live in the countryside, or, as is increasingly or predominantly the case now in Russia, because this still goes on to a large extent, outside the city. So you have urban dwellers coming out of the city to little plots of land in the countryside to grow stuff and keep animals. And it provides and has provided a significant amount of the food that Russia produces. Huge amount of, like 50% of Russia's agricultural output is by value is produced by ordinary people. And so what I try to do with that example, there's an entire chapter on dasher gardening, which I base on this really fantastic PhD that was produced in 2008 by a man called Leonard Sharashkin. I try to suggest that one of the things we can do to resist the Great Reset, or one of the alternative system that we could create, would be one in which actually maybe people start to produce a bit of their food themselves, because actually it doesn't take all that. It takes a certain amount of work, of course, and I think Russians work maybe an average of 17 hours a week during the growing season, which is only 4 months, on their dasher gardens. But that's half the amount of time that the average American spends in front of the television a week. So it's not that much time, really. And it would obviously do everyone good. It would probably produce a much fitter nation. So I'm trying to envisage a different system, a system that isn't a system of agriculture, a system of food production that isn't rooted in corporate control. We need to take back. I don't want to sound like a Marxist here. We need to take back the means of food production, because the corporations that have seized them, or the corporations to which we have ceded control of them, don't have our best interests in heart, and they have made us so much sicker, so much more dependent, and so much less free than we were 100 years ago. And the dasher gardening thing is a template. I mean, there are obviously differences between the US and Russia, not least of all wealth. But actually, one of the interesting statistics that I use in the book is that the total land under cultivation in Russia by dasher gardeners is less than much less than the total area of private lawns in the US. So, you've already got enough land under private control just in lawns in the US to produce a similar system if you wanted to. But the question then is political will and how you would build such a movement. And that's something that I talk about at length in the book too, where I try to start to sort of sketch out how we might create a movement for reform of food that would allow people to produce their own food, or a decent proportion of their own food, perhaps, because there are all sorts of terrible, ridiculous regulations in the US about food production. There are areas, counties, whatever, where there are actually local laws that prevent you from growing any food in your garden. You're actually not allowed to grow food in certain parts of the US in your own garden, which just seems mad to me. So you can have a nice lawn, and you can keep the weeds down with plentiful applications of glyphosate, but you can't grow your own tomatoes, which, I mean, it's just, to me, it's absolutely mad. And so the kind of laws that prevent people from practicing small scale agriculture need to be seriously relaxed or done away with completely.
Yeah, it's crazy. Some states you can't even collect rain water; it's illegal. But
like Colorado, I think.
Yeah, I was going to say Colorado. I can't recall if it was Utah or wherever, but it all comes together. Guerrilla food production, as you say, coupled with our guerrilla information war and our guerrilla resistance to world government. I did have another question. You write in your book, quote, "I don't just mean that we should prevent the Great Reset from happening or create redoubts against if it does happen, although those are both possibilities," end quote. I've had on the podcast James Wesley Rawls of Survival Blog, and we've talked about the American redoubt. Everyone's fleeing to Texas or Florida, or you've got states like the Dakotas, Montana. I'm down here in Mexico. I came here over a decade ago, but how should we view, and I get what you're saying, we should fight with everything we got right now. How much value do you see in preparing like a plan B, a redoubt location in case we do get overwhelmed by the globalist forces?
Oh, I think there's always some value in having a plan B, but at the same time, maybe believing that there is a plan B might mean that you don't perhaps pursue plan A quite as hard as you might otherwise do. It's difficult. I don't think that there's a definitive answer to that question. I think that, I can't predict the future. I don't know what's going to happen. It looks pretty bleak sometimes, and I do think about, well, where can I run away to? Where can I go? To avoid this madness. But the question is, and again, we talked about this earlier. Is there anywhere in the world now where we can truly avoid the madness? And maybe for a time, then there will be readouts. But how long they'll last, I don't know. I really don't know.
Yeah, it's and I tell people I've lived in half a dozen countries. I got 3 passports. Someone called into my TNC radio show the other day saying, "Hey, we should check out El Salvador or," and I'm like, no, tomorrow it's what Edward Snowden calls turnkey tyranny. I mean, you might get some guy in tomorrow and bam, he reverses everything, and all of these. At the local level, governors, they're penetrated. Like where I live here, the governors in Mexico of the states, they're completely, I can document this it's documented. I live in the resilient city, a smart city that's financed by the Rockefeller Foundation. This is actually in the official local Mexican government documents. Gotcha. And so I'm trying to get out of here anyways, but just, one more thought. What motivation would you have for anyone listening in terms of, hitting the gym, getting fit, and starting to eat right? I'm guilty of it myself. I've been on and off, but now, thanks to the Raw Egg Nationalism movement, I'm really fired up to start getting back into shape. Fantastic. And eating correctly. But, do you have any way of motivating people?
I think you just, for me, the motivation is to be something approaching the best possible version of myself I can be. And I think that it's important for people to realize that, and this is something that Jordan Peterson says, you're not everything that you could be. And the thing is that actually, it's not that it is difficult to make a change, but actually it's much less difficult than you think it is. And the thing is actually that positive change is cumulative in exactly the same way that bad things, negative change is cumulative. One bad thing happens and then another bad thing happens. And, soon enough, before you know it, you're homeless on the street. But actually, if you can make small changes incrementally, they will add up over time to something much greater than the sum of its parts. So, if you can, for instance, here's one thing you can do that is that will make a big difference in your life. If you can cut out all processed food from your life, all processed food from your diet, that is, you have taken a big step towards being a healthier person, because processed food that's pre-prepared food that comes in plastic. Basically, that's a decent working definition of processed food. Is laced with the worst kind of industrial food products like seed and vegetable oils, high fructose corn syrup, and other hidden sugars. These awful colorings and flavorings and other stuff like that. If you can cut out processed food and start actually cooking food for yourself and preparing fresh food made with whole ingredients, then you'll be a long way towards fixing your diet and your health. And then on top of that, you've just got to start moving a little bit more. If you're a very sedentary person, then just start walking. Just go for a walk each day, and build slowly over time. It's not going to happen overnight. Transformation will take years. It'll take 2 years, 3 years, 4 years. But actually, within a year or even 6 months, you'll look back at your former self and you'll think, God, I can't believe that was me. I am a different person now. And it will be true.
Yeah, this stuff can be done quickly. I mean, I recall many years ago when I was when I went back to in the gym, just the difference you can see in just a couple months is amazing. And so, yeah, we all need to start focusing on bettering ourselves and fighting the good fight. Where are the best places? I'll include all of your links in the description, but just for you to let us know what are your best projects and best places to find you online.
Fantastic. So I'm Baby Gravy 9 on Twitter. You can go to rawegnationalist.com, which has links to all of my media appearances and stuff like that. And then there's mansworldmag.org, which is where you'll find everything to do with my magazine. So between those three places, I think you should be able to find just about everything you need.
Yeah, I highly recommend the Eggs Benedict option book. I'm gonna have to get your cookbook. You've got one as well, and yeah, Man's World magazine is free, right, for the digital version, and you sell a physical version as well. Yeah,
yeah. I've started selling a physical version of each issue on Amazon, and there's also at the end of each year, then I produce a hardback annual, a bit like the Playboy annual, featuring the best articles from the year and some new exclusive content. But yeah, all of the links are available from my Twitter website or the Man's World website.
Keep up the awesome work, and thank you for being on Geopolitics and Empire.
It was my pleasure. Thank you.
I hope you enjoyed this Geopolitics and Empire podcast. The website is geopoliticsandempire.com, and I encourage you to sign up for the free email list that goes out with each podcast and every weekend with a collection of news headlines. The newsletter and website are our last lines of defense. We're being censored and deplatformed. It's nearly impossible to find Geopolitics and Empire on the Google search engine. We've been blacklisted. YouTube frequently takes down our videos with strikes. Facebook restricts our page. Reddit and Twitter take down posts. And after the Associated Press mentioned Geopolitics and Empire in a 2021 article co-written with NATO, our Patreon account was terminated. Vimeo also terminated our Pro account. The best free way to help Geopolitics and Empire is to leave a review on Apple Podcasts or elsewhere and subscribe to all of our media channels. You can find the video broadcast now on 5 platforms: Odyssey, Rockfin, Rumble, BitChute, and Brighteon. You can find the audio broadcast on the podcast ecosystem: SoundCloud, Apple, Spotify, and so on. My current favorite social media channels are Twitter and Telegram, but you can also find us on Gab, MeWe, Minds, Float, VK, Instagram, Facebook, and LinkedIn. Finally, Geopolitics and Empire is in dire need of funding to continue. You can leave a donation, purchase a consultation with the host, or become a member to receive additional benefits. We also produce a weekly broadcast called Dissident Thinker for members and Rockfin subscribers only. We will continue to fight the good fight come hell or high water. Thank you for listening.